And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio here on the Big Talker 106.7 FM. We are very proud to have our colleague, Managing Director of Consumer Choice Center, Fred Roeder, who is here on the line. We got him on video. Fred, sir, welcome to Consumer Choice Radio, yet another episode.
Hello, welcome. Hi from London.
Good to talk to you, Fred. And David and I wanted to get you on because there's a lot of things that we've been producing and writing, and you had a great article. This one was in CapX, The Folly of Opposing Patents on a COVID Vaccine. We're hearing a lot about pharmaceutical drugs. We're hearing a lot about accessibility. And now we're hearing in various jurisdictions about patents and whether or not they should even exist and whether intellectual property as an idea should even matter with everything that we're facing. So I wanted to get you on and we want to discuss your article and figure out your ideas about this. So tell us what's happening here in this whole space.
Sure, let's do this. So there are many civil society groups, but also politicians or journalists who currently see the COVID-19 crisis, and they're very worried about people having actually access to to medicines and to vaccines. And they basically asked that, at least for COVID-19, both treatments, drugs, and also vaccines should not be allowed to have any patents. This is currently the discussion. And one group which is really loud about this is Doctors Without Borders, an organization I really admire. They managed to raise over $1 billion a year from private donors to help during health crises, especially low and middle income countries. So this is a great organization, but I think they got their stance on fighting intellectual property rights wrong. The reason why we have very bad healthcare systems in a lot of low and middle income countries is not because of the existence of patents, but it's actually because of high tariffs and taxes you have to pay in these countries to even import pharmaceuticals and to sell them. You have very bad healthcare infrastructure, rundown hospitals, not enough doctors. So these are the real problems. And what we need to keep in mind when, especially facing the crisis right now, is it's not the problem that there is a really expensive drug to treat COVID-19 or a vaccine no one can afford. The problem is we do not really have something that helps us to cure this disease yet, or we don't have a ready-to-go vaccine. So what we actually need is incentives to produce this. And by abolishing exactly those incentives, which is intellectual property, which is the right to profit from your invention, we disincentivize companies, researchers, and investors to put more resources behind getting us out of this crisis as quickly as possible.
So, I mean, the cynics on the other side of this debate will say, well, if we have intellectual property kind of hold true for this, the company that finds the vaccine or let's say a cure is going to use that patent and basically gouge the world to recover. Based on your knowledge and expertise, is that likely? Are there examples that show us that isn't the case, that companies can find cures with IP and not end up in a scenario like that?
Yes, absolutely. So right now there are over 24 companies that try to find cures and vaccines, working vaccines for COVID-19. And some of these companies have a very interesting track record of already inventing and developing vaccines and also treatments for viral diseases. And it's usually that pharmaceutical companies make actual profits and sell their drugs at high prices only in a handful of countries. These are countries where patients can actually afford this. The United States, Germany, the UK, France, Japan, and most other countries are receiving most of these drugs basically at production cost, which is not very high. If you, for instance, look at Gilead, a pharmaceutical company from San Francisco, they currently have also a drug in trials which might help to reduce the mortality rate of COVID-19. It's not really clear if that works yet, but the same company has also drugs against hepatitis C, which really cures your hepatitis C. And they sell it for quite a high price in some developed countries like the US or Germany. But in most countries, they give it away for just a few $100s for the entire treatment cycle. So they just give it to other companies in India or in South America to sell it at a much lower price. And if I say much lower, it's like 70 times lower than in developed countries. So if you're actually concerned about poor people in low and middle income countries having access to treatments, vaccines, and cures, you can actually see that companies that are able to make a profit of their drug in some wealthy countries also have the ability to almost donate or give these drugs away at cost in many developing countries. You can see the same for HIV and many other diseases. So philanthropy in this industry is actually very large because the companies do not want that patients don't have access, but they also need to make some money because it costs about $2 billion to bring a drug to the market. And vaccines even are a bit more specific because a lot of vaccines are public-private partnerships. So it's often the government teaming up with these innovative companies and helping to fund the development of this. And then there's usually agreement that this patent for the vaccine can also be used by other companies, or the vaccine can be distributed at an already given price to patients. We could see this, for instance, with the Ebola vaccine, which I believe Gilead actually also has one Ebola vaccine. So this shouldn't be too much a problem, but what is dangerous is taking the incentive away for companies to actually own a patent afterwards, because then no one would want to make these massive investments anymore. And right now what we need is more investments and more incentives to cure diseases. I might repeat myself, but we so far can only cure 5% of all known diseases. And that means 95% of diseases we cannot cure yet. And COVID-19 is one of these diseases where we're now basically shutting down the world economy because we don't know how to cope with it. And we need to accelerate access and to medicine and vaccines. But we can only do this by first accelerating the research, because we don't even know what will come out and how this drug is going to look like. And it's the private sector developing these things.
Yeah, and I think I guess it was almost 2-3 months ago, Fred, we had you on the program and we were talking about the Carol-Baskins virus. We call it the COVID. That's our name for it. We talked about that and sort of how it was developing, how it was spreading across, how it was affecting economies. You are a health economist by training. One thing that we're hearing a lot about is essentially in some places we need to flatten the curve and all of this, and we need to do it as long as there's no vaccine, which is not at all what we were told in the beginning. I'm just kind of wondering, what is the process for developing these vaccines right now? Like, how many of these companies are trying to do it? Are we going to see more innovation from some of these companies, or all just Bill Gates? Are we just waiting on Bill Gates to come up with the solution to everything? How's that working?
Yeah, so there are dozens of companies currently working on a vaccine, and they all have potentially different approaches towards it. It's trial and error. And most of these companies will fail, and their investments will fail. I mean, they will lose money by trying to find a vaccine for COVID-19. And some of these companies now receive also public support. And even as a small government person, I would say, investing taxpayers' money in developing a vaccine for this disease which cripples our economy is probably not the worst use of money. It's probably better than paying another 1.5 years for furloughing schemes and bailing out other industries. And then basically how this works is some clinical trials have already started for some of these companies, where they actually want to see if their way of using antibodies or whatever they do works to create some immunity towards COVID-19. Then once they've figured this out, they need to get approval for the vaccine, which probably will happen quickly because there's a political will to accelerate approvals from, for instance, the FDA in the US, so the European Medicines Agency in Europe. Usually these things take years. Right now, these things go overnight. It's very interesting that this is possible now, which hasn't been possible half a year ago. But then we also need to figure out how to mass produce these vaccines. And there were, for instance, some news that some parts of a vaccine can be actually grown in tobacco plants. So I believe one company in Kentucky is working on this. So you basically need to, because you need to have billions of doses, right? And that's not just that you switch on a factory and produce it, because you have also biological components of this. Because usually what you do is to put a very weak strain or dead strain, non-active strain of the virus, something you bioengineered, which looks like it, into the human body, and then your body reacts in a way that it creates antibodies for the actual virus. Everyone who had the flu shot knows how this works. So, but mass producing this, so even if we might have good news in a couple of months that a vaccine has been found effective, mass manufacturing this numbers of billions will not happen overnight. But that's probably a process of, who knows, 6 to 12 months. And then you also need to distribute it. I've been once in a warehouse for vaccines, which was a wholesaler for vaccines, and it has very complicated cooling chain. You need to make sure the vaccine is not exposed to light. It needs to be stored at a certain temperature. You cannot shake it too much. So this is a very complicated logistical problem as well, which will probably work fairly well in countries that have regular annual flu shots, such as most European countries, the US, Canada. But then again, countries in low and middle income countries will have the problem of a lack of healthcare infrastructure. So there might be full warehouses somewhere in Nigeria with a vaccine, but they don't know how to get it to the patients without the vaccine getting damaged or being invalid. And this is something definitely also organizations such as the Bill Gates Foundation and the Global Alliance for Vaccines, Gavi, which is also co-funded by the Gates Foundation, has an important role because they try to figure out how to get this to people. But I mean, there are many players who are working on a vaccine, and probably before people get vaccinated, it will at least take another year, even if we have very quick progress now, because it's not just producing an aspirin pill, but it's actually like a biological process. So it's a bit more complicated than just sending around pills.
And how does the complication of producing a vaccine play into intellectual property? Because I asked that question. I know that in Canada, the federal government suspended the Patent Act, and that always, essentially they did it so that generic manufacturers would be permitted to basically create anything that the government deemed necessary without respecting intellectual property or the patents. I always thought that was kind of silly because even if you were to give these generic companies, let's say, the blueprints to create a vaccine, they don't necessarily have the institutional knowledge or supply chain access to actually manufacture it at scale. Does that play into the issue of in terms of a vaccine? You've explained that it's very complicated to make, but does getting rid of intellectual property basically open the door to further mistakes, or maybe firms or companies that are trying to manufacture these vaccines without proper processes or anything along those lines?
Absolutely. And again, like, manufacturing a vaccine is not easy, and supply chain, just like from where you grow the components that go into the vaccine to how you store it and how you manufacture the liquid. So it's usually in liquid. It depends how the vaccine is being built, but probably will be an injection. That definitely requires a lot of know-how. So you probably create more time lags by just taking the know-how or the patent and giving it to other companies, because they have not been involved in the research. And usually while you conduct all your research and try to develop the product, you also define how your supply chain looks like and the distribution of it. So that definitely creates time lags. Probably Canadian companies can figure this out because they're sophisticated, but looking at developing countries, the question is also if there's even the know-how how to manufacture this vaccine once you've taken away the patent. But the bigger risk is just, if you start doing this, you just stifle future medical innovation. And the COVID-19 is not the last virus this Earth will see. New things will emerge, and we need to have a very, very innovative biotech and pharmaceutical research sector that we are able to quickly overcome these problems. And I mean, we've seen manufacturing problems just like with simple products such as test kits and personal protection equipment, where a lot of millions of PPE and testing kits have been shipped to the UK and the US and Belgium and Germany, and then once these things usually come from China, and they basically faulty. They just don't work, and that shows how important good manufacturing practices and know-how are. And you only incentivize people investing in manufacturing practices and know-how if they know they can own their innovation.
Definitely true. You're listening to Consumer Choice Radio on the Big Talker 106.7 FM. We've been speaking with Fred Roeder. He is the managing director of Consumer Choice Center, health economist by training. The article we're discussing is The Folly of Opposing Patents on a COVID Vaccine. That's on CapX. We'll share the link either below if you're watching on video or audio if you're listening to our radio show or podcast. You can follow him on Twitter at Fred Cyrus Roeder. Fred, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much.